Greetings all, and welcome to the first video in our discussion series, where I'm taking questions from the audience, worldwide audience, students inside the school, outside the school, viewers, followers, fans, and general enthusiasts for Taijiquan and Kung Fu. We're taking questions, and we'll read the questions on the video and answer to the best of my ability. Some of these questions are kind of long and involved, so as I might just answer them off the top of my head in person, some of them I had to think about and wanted to give the most concise and clear answer I could come up with, so I did write them, and I'm going to read them and discuss them. So if you see me looking around, I haven't lost my cat, or maybe I have, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm gonna read. I got notes, and we're gonna dig into some topics here. So for this first video, we've assembled a few questions which have to do with forms, practicing forms, and that type of thing. That's our theme, because a bunch of people asked about this. And as usual, my own thinking tends to stray. I can be a bit tangential and even verbose. So it might go in a few different areas. So we're going to start with a question from someone named Josh. And the question, we'll break up the question into a few parts. But the first says, the title is Kata outdated? Okay, kata referring to the Japanese term that refers to form practice. Okay, and the question is as follows. Some folks, particularly the combat sports guys, some claiming a background in extensive study of sports science, believe that kata is an outdated training method and best delegated to being a warm-up before the actual practice. That if you're training primarily for the purpose of effective learning, you're better off with modern methods than kata and forms training. May I ask, what are the thoughts here about that? Do you practice forms because you believe in its effectiveness for combat training and learning, or merely because of tradition? So the answer to both of these is probably no. And I know that sounds a little vague intentionally, but I'm going to elaborate. Okay, so kata, although a Japanese term, has the equivalent Chinese term of taolu, meaning a set or a road, path, with dual implications of a matched set of things or a path of strung together moves like a paragraph of writing. Okay, so in Chinese, we would use the word tao, means a set, like a set of clothing, like yi tao yifu is a set of clothing. So it can be like a matched set, but tao lu means a road or path, so that's pretty direct. It means a set road or path. Okay. Even the Japanese approaches have quite a range, from performance to a rather linear, direct, encyclopedic container of application actions. On the far end of that spectrum would be the encyclopedic container of applications that over time has developed depth in movement approach such that it eclipses the original intent of the strung together applications. Some of the Okinawan and other old karate traditions do approach this. At this very far end of such a spectrum is the point at which Taijiquan starts, and quite likely exactly where it started in the beginning. Similar to Japanese martial arts, which mostly originate from Chinese martial arts anyhow, most old Chinese non-sport martial arts also had taolu for the dual purpose of conditioning and encyclopedic application containers. In this sense, we could say it is triple purpose: conditioning, familiarity with application methods, and then a combination of those two, which is another important concept in Chinese cosmology. Yin and yang, giving birth to a third quality that is greater than the sum of its parts. In this case, the third quality is the physical embodiment of the application movements and methods themselves, and what we call gongfu. Tradition and aesthetics play a part, but again, there is a range. The most effective and useful arts have aesthetic and traditional concerns that do not overwhelm the functional and practical aspects. Taolu or kata itself is not intended for combat training. At the higher quality and functionality end of the Taolu spectrum, it's all about training naturalized movement memory and habit. That can be used in combative situations, but what is gained in Taolu must still be trained into usage situations via drill and spar, etc. In this way, it is not much different from the Western boxing approach to training. Individual striking methods, then combinations until muscle memory and the boxing body is built, before taking those tools into the ring and developing timing, reflexes, spatial awareness. Taolu is not directly applicable to fighting in the same way working with a heavy or speed bag is not. Okay, now he asks, kata, if I'm not mistaken, was historically a method of recording techniques before the invention of high-definition video cameras. To my knowledge, however, the way Taijiquan goes about forms is a little different than how an art like, say, karate uses kata. Okay. Again, I think this relates to the idea of the spectrum. Japanese kata, no matter how far to the depth and movement end of the spectrum it may be, still does not even reach the starting point of Taijiquan, which is much, much further down that spectrum towards depth. Japanese arts in general are much more focused on getting a particular job done, which is often some kind of a strike or application, and then add to that a special body action and conditioning. Taijiquan, by contrast, while a form may contain many applications, those application methods become vehicles in service to the development of other things. Body method, shenfa, jin, which is refined strength mechanisms, conditioning, jibin gong and gong li, and energetic activity, the famed qi. It's like a feedback loop. Train applications in such a way that they cultivate other aspects at the same time. Eventually, those other aspects overwhelm the application development. Then use the other aspects to develop and improve applications, etc. And the question goes on, if a kata in karate is a record of one possible application, a form in Taijiquan may contain multiple possible applications, which makes it more versatile than kata. Forms in your lineage seem to also serve as a form of body conditioning exercise, given how painful and strenuous even the starter forms in this lineage are. True to a point. I'm sure there are also hidden or accessory applications in any one move in kata, in Japanese arts, depending on the art. But it again is much, much more limited in this aspect than Taijiquan, which has almost never a single application focus, and more myriad hidden methods than obvious. Kata also involve body conditioning for sure, but it's different. Regarding body conditioning, yes, our line is singularly strenuous. All lines of Taijiquan's forms are supposed to be this way, but unfortunately, they are not. It is safe to say that at this point, actually most are not. Taijiquan is a martial art that has suffered many insults and injuries over decades of socio-political changes. We are lucky any of it survived halfway intact. Most of it did not. The degraded remnants of so much of it is still thrilling enough to inspire a lot of people. Trust me when I say that when a more intact version is found, the great majority of people will not want to train it, as the experience is too bitter. The question continues. The combat sports MMA crowd tends to throw the baby out with the bathwater, however, dismissive of any form of training not immediately applicable in the ring. And they are rife with ineffective and inefficient practices themselves, i.e., unskilled pad holding actually ingrains bad habits in fighters. They could very well be overlooking something here. All right, and that is the end of the question from Josh. And to address that part, I would say this is not my area of expertise. I can just say that the MMA and traditional Chinese martial arts worlds have two different goals. MMA is motivated towards financial reward, fast ego gratification, and quick functional results, all things that diminish with age. Traditional Kung Fu is generally motivated towards long-term survival and fortitude, such as martial function well past prime, increasing rather than decreasing health, and function that relies less on the invincibility of youth than the increasing alignment with natural physics. Two very different worlds. That said, I would not want to mess with Bas Rutten or Federer at any age. All right. Edmund writes, Jin, the famed Jin. Jin, is it a strike? Is it Qinna, joint locking? It can be anything in application. Body's ability method to apply strength can be used for various use case applications. Remembering my early days when I thought each move, and I mean each gross move, a la village style, Chen village style, had one intended application. I think many of the general public still think the same. This is a common confusion, and it is not a well understood term. To make matters worse, the term was tortuously misused for decades in the context of Taijiquan in the West, referring to some kind of magical and pervasive power, or state one would maybe someday attain if lucky, or mandated by God to mastery. Usually, such mastery is a self-appointed state of being and reveals a singularly poor level of skill. Jin, in common usage, refers to strength or power in Mandarin. Okay. In the context of Taijiquan specifically, it usually has a more narrow and specific implication, being that of a refined or long-trained specific power or action, regardless of the amount of strength, nor any specific purpose. Most martial arts have methods that we could properly use this term or concept of Jin to describe. Thai boxing has the low kick, and they spend countless hours refining their body movement to optimize this kicking action. We could very accurately call this kicking body action a Jin. All we have to do is remove the intended kicking application, and there we have a raw Jin. If you can use that body and leg action for any number of intended uses, it becomes a Jin on its own. We could take the famed hip toss of judo. That also requires a well-trained body action. Remove the specific throw associated with it, and there we again have a Jin. We have a similar Jin in our method that can be used for a similar type of hip toss throw, but it can also be used for other types of throws or even just a body bash to create or take space. It's just a Jin to be employed wherever useful. In this context, we can use the same Jin to power a particular strike, a joint break, an interception, etc. It's about the particular type of refined body action. Which tool head you put on it is not so important. If it is limited to a particular tool head, we wouldn't necessarily use that word Jin. The Jin is the action itself rather than the application. The idea that in any style or line of Taijiquan, any particular sequence or action has just one big application method is again something of a trauma of history. Many of these are broken lines and incompetently reassembled martial arts. Taijiquan's essential primary ancestor arts most likely were more simple in nature and more direct in obvious applications. Taijiquan development is specifically geared towards depth and versatility. If today's practitioners are reducing such a complex and holistic martial art to a simplistic function, they are pretty far off track. Next question is from Anonymous. You know who you are. I hear that the form practice is to train a set of principles to condition the body to move correctly. I hear that form is principle-oriented and not technique-oriented. Do martial applications manifest themselves from practicing the form as the vehicle to exercise the principles? Well, I hear those things all the time as well. for many years. It is exactly the polar opposite of how I was trained. When we talk about principles, we first have to have a little study on where those principles were found. And the answer is usually books. In some cases, those books are called classics, and in others, just informational books. Chen Zhenglei once was credited with saying something quite clever when asked about the classics. He said, "Whose classics?" My own training was almost entirely by handed-down oral and experiential teaching. The so-called principles were occasionally referred to. In Chinese, this was 理论. It's called 理论. And we can call it principles, but it is also at the level of rules. The issue here is that rules or principles do vary by style, line, and school. There is the issue of the variance of principles between the lines, and then there is also the issue of the variance of how such principles are applied. You and I can be saying the same thing and understand it to mean two wildly different things in applied method. It has long been very popular, especially among modern Yang styles, to promote this idea of the perfect attainment of principles being the ultimate goal. We practice everything in the pursuit of the best embodiment of such principles. If you attain that state, you are magical, and there are layers upon layers of veiled mystical approaches to such attainment. Usually, the most adept at such a state of attainment are those who have the brazen ambition to claim they have achieved it. And that self-confident grift is compelling enough to form a coterie of devoted followers. That audience legitimizes such claims on its own. Principles as grift or alleged reality on their own do not create martial ability. No matter how they are interpreted, they are not at all an endpoint to practice or attainment. As I said, it is the reverse. Any such principles are essentially rules for practice. Maybe so-called principles are a bit harder to adhere to than simple rules, but they are still, in the end, just rules. If one can adhere to simple rules, then more complex rules, then maybe one can develop Gongfu by moving within the prescribed limits allowed by such rules. The end point, however, must be the implementation of application on the business end of the developed Gongfu. Martial applications must be specifically trained and then functionally fixed to the action of the Gongfu being trained from the beginning. Many of the traditional applications have to be taught. They will not naturally reveal themselves to a student or a teacher, just like advanced chemistry will not naturally reveal itself to the reckless amateur. Principles, or rules, are the primary guidelines for practice, the absolute opposite of the end point of practice. People who obsess and promote principles as the end goal, we could say, are actually missing functional primary guidelines. This means their Gongfu building technology is so poor that instead of the guidelines building actual Gongfu, the greatest ambition is just to finally build the guidelines themselves, the things that should have been the basic starting point. The other disappointment is that they are lacking the hereditary application technology, and so they supplant that with principles being the apex of skill. It's all a kind of cope for broken lines of Taijiquan Gongfu. History, in many cases, has not been kind to these arts. I encourage all sincere practitioners and seekers to find schools and teachers that have a higher ratio of original source material. For example, accurate guidelines for building Gongfu, and then a higher or any ratio of hereditary applications methods. At some point in history, Taijiquan was a rather clear and concise art, but a whole lot of what is left really is not. There is a lot more to say on this topic, but we'll save some of it for our next installment in this series. Please subscribe and follow for our next episode, and continue to send your questions, comments, rants, complaints to the links provided in the description. Thanks for watching, and best of progress to you all.